And good day to you. I was just listening to some music put out by a former student of mine. His name is Tom Mellon. He's in a band called the Parsnip Revolt. He lives in Philadelphia and he's got his music on the internet. He doesn't have an agent, he didn't go through a producer. He and his band went in and recorded. They did their own mixing, their own overdubbing, if you know what that is, and they put their music out on the internet. And it's very typical of what can happen today. It's very, very easy for people, including probably some people in this class, to start up a YouTube channel, to go on FaceTime, to do Facebook Live, to do a lot of things on the web that can showcase and distribute their music. It's an amazing world that we live in where really anybody can produce music and theoretically get it out to anybody else. But that's not really the case because competition has never been more fierce to get music out there into people's ears because so many people are creating music and trying to get discovered. And so we live in a world today where it's both easy to produce audio on the internet and also very difficult to get your stuff listened to. And that's the way that we're introducing today's class because we're taking on audio today. We're taking on music and talk across media. Chapter 7 for the class. After we finish today, it's going to mark our halfway point in the class. Can you believe it? Yeah, we're taking on audio. We're also taking on a very different technology today. We're moving away from printed materials as we start to head into a phase of the development of mass media that has to do with electronics. I've got lots of links for you today. Lots of those links are just music. You can check it out at your leisure if you like. It does represent the music that I'm providing for you today, certain generations of tastes, shall we say, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, so on. You can maybe play around with those links at your leisure. All right, so let's begin with the history of sound recording. And I just want to say before we get into that just imagine if you wanted to listen to music before you could record music, you had to go see a live performer. You want to see somebody you want to hear somebody play the piano, you have to go to where the piano is, where they're playing it. And that performance of that piano music will be different every single time. Because every time a person plays a song, they play it differently. I mean, it may sound similar to the time they played it before, but it's very different in many ways because it's an individual performance. All of that changes when music can be recorded. All of that changes because it can be transported and it can be saved. Music can be carried across countries. It can be moved using a medium of recording to another country as opposed to having to go to the artist to listen to it. So who's responsible for all of this? Well, it's a new inventor that we're going to introduce, moving away from Ben Franklin and an inventor that you will know very well, Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison, an inventor living just outside of New York City in New Jersey. And in fact, he actually has a museum that's a national park, the Thomas Edison National Park, where it showcases a lot of his technological inventions, not just audio inventions, but his movie making as well. So Thomas Edison, he invented in 1877 what is known as the phonograph. You can see a link for that, the phonograph. And his very first song that he recorded was Mary Had a Little Lamb. Mary had a little lamb, little lamb, little lamb. That's the song. And his contraption, if you want to call it that, consisted of a foil cylinder with a needle that went back and forth across that foil cylinder. He originally envisioned this technology as a dictation device, not as a music storage device, but as a dictation device for a lawyer who wants to dictate the brief. And the secretary or the legal secretary would take down that brief by typing it and then recording it into this foil contraption that he made. So his team made it possible for the first time for music to be stored and then played back. Now along comes another inventor who improves Thomas Edison's invention. This inventor is Emil Berliner, just like the city, Berliner, Berliner. He was from Germany, and he invented the gramophone. And the gramophone took Thomas Edison's idea, which is a physical groove that's on the foil cylinder and is picked up mechanically by a needle, and then the needle converts it electronically into the sounds that we hear. Emil Berliner did the same thing, except instead of using a foil cylinder to store music, he used a disc. A disc, like what we consider today to be vinyl, only his disc was made out of zinc. So that's what Emil Berliner did. It's a different kind of motion, right? It's a disc that's spinning this way. Now, this technology started to be improved upon further still, the idea of recording and saving music, and we get to 1935, and in 1935, we have the development of high fidelity, or hi-fi. Sound familiar? Sounds like Wi-Fi, right? Which is wireless, and high fidelity is a similar kind of abbreviation. It's speaking about high fidelity or hi-fi, which basically gives music a deeper bass and higher notes. Before hi-fi, if you listen to music being played back, it would hover around in this mid-range part of your tones, in the middle of the scale, right? So hi-fi allows these high highs and deep basses. When you hear people driving around in their boom vehicles today and boom, 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 boom in the back seat, you can thank hi-fi for that. 1949 is another date where we see a development in the technology of audio recording. 1949 is where we get magnetic tapes. Magnetic tapes showing up as reel-to-reel tapes, if you know what they are. They're like 8-inch reels. And then eventually cassette tapes, and then even onto VHS tapes and beta tapes when we get over the television side of things. But magnetic tapes made it possible to record music and then to go back and re-record that music over the same part of the tape that the previous music was recorded on. So that made it very inexpensive to produce music because you could keep practicing and doing different takes, right? By just re-recording on magnetic tape. All right, now we're going to go on to transmitting music and talk. It's not just creating it, it's not storing it, it's not moving it, but it's actually broadcasting it. And to get into this, we have to discuss the birth of radio. So I'd like you to consider before we get into this idea that before radio, communication had to be transported. I mean, think about that. Communication had to be transported. You write a letter, it has to go onto a horse and a train and a truck, and then it arrives wherever it's going to arrive. Same with a book, same with magazines. They have to carry them and move them, right? When we get to radio, the game of mass media has a fundamental change to it. Now you can broadcast what you're saying. You can stay in your house and you can send it on the other side of that mountain. So for the first time, you can say that the barriers of space, as far as a barrier of preventing communication, is eliminated. Space is no longer an issue. And the first technology to crash this barrier of space was the telegraph. The telegraph, you can see a link for that in my email today. It looks like a stapler with a wire to it. And a telegraph uses Morse code. Originally, telegraphs were used by railroads. So if you're in San Francisco and the train is leaving and headed for LA, you can telegraph ahead to the LA train station, and you can say, train is on time or train is late. The code that was used was Morse code. Samuel Morse in the Army developed this code of dots and dashes because at this time, voice could not yet be broadcast, could not yet be transmitted. So they used dots and dashes. A deet is a dot, and a D, a longer hold on it, is a dash. So we have the telegraph now that is starting to allow people to communicate from places that are not local. They're on the other side of the mountain. They're on the other side of the country. It's breaking that barrier of space. And in fact, the U.S. constructed a cable across the Atlantic all the way to Europe so that telegraph communication could take place. Unfortunately, those wires could be cut. They could be sabotaged by war efforts. And so that technology didn't last that long, but it was the first time that the two continents had been connected in real time, if you want to think of it that way. So wireless or telegraph is the foundation of electronic media and specifically radio. And the person who came to invent radio is the person that we want to highlight next. And his name is Heinrich Hertz, Hertz, like the car rental company. And he's in 1888. And he developed radio not as a practical thing that was actually radio transmission. He developed it as a theory because he was a physicist. So imagine a person drawing all these formulas on a chalkboard. That's what he was doing. And he came up with the idea that you could actually transmit sound over the airwaves. He worked it out in his mind theoretically, though it had not yet been put into practice through technology. So that takes place through an Italian inventor. His name is Guglielmo Marconi, Marconi. In 1894, Marconi created what was known as the first wireless telegraph. The first wireless telegraph. In other words, you could do the dee 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 dee, but you don't need wires between the two telegraph receivers. You can send it over the airways. So originally, this kind of communication, the dee 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 wireless telegraph, took place point to point. That is to say, between one person and one other person. Next up is another physicist who comes along in 1901. This physicist's name is Reginald Fessenden. Reginald Fessenden, Fessenden, and he made it possible to send voice over the airwaves. So a physicist made it possible to send, first of all, Morse code, and then a second physicist made it possible to send voice. And this is important because the inventors here, they're scientists. They're not mass media people. These are scientists, physicists trying to invent a technology that later becomes radio. All right, now the next person we want to highlight is a person who was working for the Marconi company. Guglielmo Marconi had a company. This person's name was David Sarnoff. David Sarnoff, and he's got an interesting story to him because he was on board that ship called the Carpathia. Does that ring a bell? The Carpathia was sent out to rescue the Titanic, and David Sarnoff was the ensign who was in charge of sending communication back to New York to say, hey, we've got a sinking ship. We need you to have ambulances and blankets and food supplies and medical supplies ready. So that's what David Sarnoff became famous for. But later he went on to work for the Marconi company. And as he was working for this Marconi radio company, he had a vision. And his vision was captured in a famous memo that he wrote called the Music Box Memo, also known as the Radio Music Box Memo. And in this memo, which I provide a link for, with the exact quote in the memo, he wanted to make radio a household utility. He wanted to make it a household, rather than a point-to-point communication between two people in the military. He envisioned a radio receiver in a home providing entertainment. It's like taking a jukebox out of a milkshake shop and put it into the home. That's what the box is, right? The radio box. And that was seen as very visionary because he's really the first one to make radio, and really any form of mass media, a social medium. Radio was a social medium in the very beginning because it would be a topic of conversation. Radio was in everybody's family room, just like a television set is today. People would arrange their furniture around the radio set. Usually they'd have the couch right up next to the radio so you could lay down, reach behind you, and change channels or turn the volume up and down on the radio receiver. All right, now let's talk about the biggest company that was in radio at this time. It was called RCA, or the Radio Corporation of America, RCA. And basically what happened was during World War II, the Navy seized all of the radio technology patents that were developed. The Navy seized those because this was a technology that if it fell into the hands of enemies could be used in the war effort. And so RCA, the World War I, the World War II, the government said, we can't let this technology get into the enemy's hands. We're gonna seize all these patents, and we're going to create a company called RCA, so that the government's not going to control the patents, but they'll still be kept from being infiltrated by the enemy. So the Radio Corporation of America was formed to hold these patents, and it was actually formed out of other companies. It was formed out of General Electric, which is a company that makes refrigerators. It was formed out of AT&T, and that company, you may not realize, stands for American Telegraph and Telephone Company. If you have AT&T cell phone service today, you're tapping into one of the oldest companies in the United States, AT&T, American Telegraph and Telephone. Also, this company RCA was formed out of Westinghouse, which used to make refrigerators also for train cars. And then finally, the fourth company is the United Fruit Company. A strange mix with these other companies, the United Fruit Company, but the United Fruit Company had all these banana plantations down in Central America. So they wanted these ships to be able to communicate with the plantation because, without having to get off of the ship. So all of this leads to the very first radio broadcast, which I'm very happy to say took place right here in Pennsylvania. The very first radio broadcast took place in Pittsburgh at the radio station KDKA. KDKA. If you're wondering why does it begin with a K, it's because at that time, before the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, was making laws about what your call letters, the K sound, must be. They eventually said that every radio station to the west of the Mississippi has to begin with a K, and every radio station to the east of the Mississippi has to begin with a W. That's why most stations today are W stations on the East Coast, but we have a station like KDKA, which is grandfathered, and also KYW News Radio in Philadelphia is another example. So at any rate, we have this burgeoning radio industry growing up, and KDKA was the very first broadcaster. It was owned by Westinghouse, the company Westinghouse, and Westinghouse said, you know, it's a presidential election this year, 1920. Let's put a transmitter, the way of sending radio out, on the top of the tallest building in Pittsburgh, and we will broadcast the election returns of Harding and Cox, the two people who were running for the election. That was the very first radio broadcast that happened to be a news broadcast. Almost right away, though, radio was used as a commercial medium. There's a radio station in New York called WEAF, and it was the very first to sell advertising, although at that time they called it a toll. You know, like you get on the highway, you pay a toll to use it. That's what advertising first was on WEAF. It was called a toll, and the first toll was purchased by AT&T. And all stations virtually after that followed that model of using advertising to pay the bills. One of the networks that was formed, if you know what a network is, it's a collection of stations that are fed with programming by a studio that is the network studio, like NBC or CBS or ABC. They record the programs, they produce the programs, and they send them out to the network of affiliates. The affiliates are located all across the United States. And one of the very first affiliates was in 1923. And 1923, RCA formed the NBC network, the NBC National Broadcasting Corporation Network. NBC is still around today. And unfortunately, NBC grew too big, and the government said, oh, it's turning into a monopoly. We need to do something about that. So what happened next was RCA was divided into two networks. NBC was divided into two networks, the Red Network and the Blue Network, and it was forced to sell off the Red Network so that it wasn't competing too much. All right, now let's move on to television. So television comes on the scene, but it's on the back of radio in the golden age. So the golden age for radio is the 1920s to the 1940s, and that's where you had the best actors, the most advertising dollars, the best talent were in radio. They were producing all kinds of programs that you wouldn't envision today, like soap operas and mysteries and comedies and sci-fi and documentaries and sports and variety shows. There were all kinds, and westerns. There were all kinds of programs. And actually here at WESS Radio, East Stroudsburg University, we offer a vintage radio hour from 9 to 10 in the morning during the regular semester because we have a collection of vintage radio programs in our possession. At any rate, that was radio's golden age. And one of the most important radio shows during this time period by today's standards is exceedingly racist. It was called Amos and Andy. You can listen to a clip of it, Amos and Andy, which were actually two white guys portraying two black people. It was a comedy, but the comedy was based on the black people seeming slow, and in some ways you could even say they were being made to seem stupid. And that was the basis of the comedy. Completely vile comedy. It's important to call it out. It was sheer racism. This was a program that was celebrated in the 1920s. We're going to talk about it, but we're going to call it what it is, Amos and Andy. Television was actually invented in the 40s. We're going to have a whole class on the 40s, but for now we need to mention that in the 1950s, it started claiming radio's audiences. Radio's audiences were fleeing to television. I mean, who would want to listen to the Lone Ranger when you can actually watch the Lone Ranger on television? And so all the advertisers, the actors, they went over to television. Radio almost collapsed and people were giving up radio for dead. But radio finally found its footing with a formula that still propels it today. It's called format radio, or niche radio, if you like. And it's the idea of, instead of trying to go for every kind of listener that you can get in radio, instead what you should do is just go for a niche audience, a small audience, a demographic audience. And the way that you do that is by formatting your radio station with a very specific format that's only liked by certain people. So for example, Top 40, that's a format. It's not everybody's kind of music. It's probably nobody's kind of music, but it does have strong appeal to young people, 18 to 25, and mostly to females. So that's an example of how radio is going after just a very specific demographic, and all the ads that you're going to hear will be things like tanning salons on there. So that's going to be specifically for that audience. All right, now let's move on to a more general subject of music, youth culture, and society, because radio starts to play a role in a kind of revolution that takes place in the United States. And what is behind that revolution is rock and roll. Rock and roll, it's a bunch of new instruments that are being played, the electrification of the solid body guitar, the lead guitar, the rhythm guitar. That's very important to the development of rock and roll. Before 1948, an important year, before 1948, there were a lot of recordings by black musicians, but their records would not be played on radio because of the racism that exists in the United States. And their records were known as race records because they would not be played. And rhythm and blues was a cultural art form that black musicians pulled upon. Rhythm and blues comes from slaves singing to each other across the fields to get through the day as they're picking cotton and talking about their plight. So blues has a very political base to it, but it also has a musical form that later evolved into rock and roll through artists like Wynonie Harris, Wynonie. Again, I have links for this. In 1947, he produced the tune Good Rockin' Tonight. And that became a big hit on black jukeboxes and later radio stations. But still, there was racism in America, and radio executives were helping to perpetuate this racism, and they were not quite ready to go full out with black musicians. So they said, there's great music being made by black musicians, but we need a white person to sing it. And that's how Elvis Presley was found. Elvis Presley was selected mostly, he was talented, but they selected him because he was playing black music. He was combining rhythm and blues with hillbilly music and some early forms of rock and roll. Now later on, a black musician does come along and really makes rock have its vintage rock sound, and that is Chuck Berry. Chuck Berry, black musician, black guitar player. Johnny B. Good is a famous song. Maybelline, another famous song. He was an excellent guitar player and a beautiful songwriter, and he added that rock and roll sound. Now, at the same time, radio is adopting this rock and roll sound, eventually adopting black artists. There were very famous disc jockeys that were known nationwide, like Alan Freed and Dave Phillips. They were playing on these very big radio stations in the Midwest and Chicago, and they were helping to create this culture of music and youth, because music was taken up by young people to express themselves and to get out from underneath the old ways of living. The 1950s people with two perfect kids and closely cut hair and gel put in the hair and a barbecue outside and an insurance job for dad. Youth rebelled against that in the 1960s. So now let's look at how music changed as it appealed to youth. And the first genre of music that we want to highlight is Motown music. Motown music named after Detroit, where motors are produced, car manufacturers. So Motor City, Motown music, that's where it's coming from. And Motown Records was founded by an African American named Berry Gordy, Berry Gordy. He founded it just like Frederick Douglass founded the newspaper that we spoke about last class as an outlet for black musicians with black producers on a black record label. Some of the biggest artists on his record label were included Marvin Gaye and the Supremes. After Motown, we get the British invasion. The British invasion, a bunch of rock and roll bands from Britain that came over to the United States and dominated our hits for a long time. I'm talking about the Beatles, I'm talking about the Rolling Stones, I'm talking about The Who, I'm talking about Pink Floyd, I'm talking about Led Zeppelin, I'm talking about the Kinks. There were just a whole slew of bands. And these bands started to produce what were known as concept albums. Concept albums meaning you don't just listen to one song, you have to listen to the whole album because there's a story that's told there. One of the most famous concept albums, which was number 1 on Billboard, the magazine that ranks songs for 10 years in a row, was Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. Now, in the 1970s, another invention takes place which helps out music. It's called stereo, and it allows you to divide up music into the left channel and the right channel, and all of a sudden you've got a greater depth to music. You can hear one guitar on one channel, one guitar on the other. So the 1970s made songs had more fidelity, and songs could be layered. And in fact, artists in the 60s and the 70s were experimenting with what's known as multi-track recording. No longer is it an experiment, it's just the way that music is made. Multi-track recording is where you lay down one track, like the drums, then you come back and while you're listening to the drums, you record the vocals over that. So music no longer has to be produced with all of the musicians in the same place at the same time. You can lay down the drum tracks in Los Angeles, and you can add a saxophone in Paris if you want to. It totally changes how music is produced. In the 1970s, we get a new genre, the genre of disco. KC and the Sunshine Band, Anita Hill, lots of black artists and white artists getting into this kind of music that is kind of fun or funny by today's standards. It's got a big bass guitar and funny dancing. You can look at John Travolta in the link that I sent in Saturday Night Fever doing the famous disco dance. Look at his moves. Wow, really, wow, John Travolta. At this time also the producer in the 60s, 70s, and 80s starts to have a greater role in the creation of music. The producer goes in, like Quincy Jones and Rick Rubin, and they are the ones who are rearranging songs, adding input onto what instruments should be played, guiding the musicians. Later on, hip-hop starts to emerge. It's the idea of rapping or speaking over music. It starts in the inner cities of the United States. It's the most popular music form today, not on radio because of the profanity problem, but certainly amongst young people. And we've got Sugar Hill Gang Rapper's Delight. And that's one of the very first rap songs. And the lyrics were taken from a Bronx master of ceremonies. So a lot of the street music of rap is growing up on New York. And then, of course, it moves out to LA and you get the East Coast, West Coast divide for rap. Also developing as a genre is country music. Country music used to be confined to the South with twangy guitars. Hank Williams, for example, but it gets a new sound when MTV comes out because MTV brings a visual image to music, and country music realized, if we get really good-looking stars like Garth Brooks and later Taylor Swift, people considered to be good-looking, and Darius Rucker, for example, from Hootie and the Blowfish, then all of a sudden we have a visual appeal to our music, and so country music breaks out of the South and becomes spread across America, not just because of the looks of people, but also because it starts to adopt more rock and roll sounds, less twangy guitar, more rock and roll sounds. And big artists like Johnny Cash and Merle Haggard, they give away to the artists that we have today, country music artists who almost sound like rock and rollers. All right, so there are concerns about the effects of rock music on young people. Rock music and really all pop music has been blamed for drug use. It's been blamed for misogyny, particularly rap music. Misogyny is the mistreatment of women, making them out to be hoes, for example, and glamorizing gang life. Music has been blamed for that. Now, when we look at the changing technologies that music is listened to, today it's on the phone and it's wireless and it's streaming from a cloud. But we have been through many technologies, including the LP, which is vinyl, which stands for long play, and then the 45, which is also vinyl, and the 45 refers to how many times it must rotate, 45 revolutions per minute. Then we go to CDs, which makes music digital, and then eventually we go to MP3s, and now we have music being able to be stored. Hardly anybody carries around music on CDs or any other device today, even a flash drive. Most people just have music, or most people just know they can go onto music and ask for a music choice. So what is the future of music? The future of music is going to involve more digital streaming. That's for sure. Many radio stations, including WESS, listen to online through streaming. We know that that's going to continue on as people expect to get their music for free through streaming. We also know that podcasting is going to continue to play a bigger role. Podcasting is the idea of recording or doing it live, a broadcast, but it's not having to adhere to the old restrictions of you must start it exactly at 7 o'clock and finish exactly at 7:30. And podcasting doesn't have rules about what you can say profanity-wise or even racism-wise. Podcast is like a wild west out there. You see more and more people doing podcasts, recording in their own home studios as opposed to having to rely on producers. So that right there is going to wrap up our class today on audio, music, and talk across media. Have a great day.